Marić was 16 years old when this photograph was taken. The year was 1891, and she was the only girl attending the Royal Classical High School in Zagreb, Croatia. With her father's encouragement, she will attend a women's preparatory college in Zurich, the University of Zurich, the University of Heidelberg, and Zurich Polytechnicum, Swiss Poly. Accomplished and brilliant, she made one tragic mistake. She fell in love with Albert Aјnštaјn. They were married in Bern, Switzerland in 1903, where they worked together on the papers that would make him the most famous scientist of the 20th century. When Albert achieved fame, he divorced Mileva, and her contributions to their work were obscured. She was known only as the woman who had made Albert Aјnštaјn unhappy. She was born in 1875 in the home of her wealthy grandparents in Titel, Vojvodina, which at that time was part of Hungary. She was baptized into the Eastern Orthodox Church 10 days later. Her father, Milef Maриć, was a civil servant for the Austro-Hungarian government. When Mileva was 2 years old, Milos was transferred to Ruma. Mileva was born with a hip deformity that caused her to limp severely. When she started the girls' school in Ruma, the children made fun of her disability. Already shy by nature, Mileva became even more introverted. As the girls' school in Ruma had only 3 grades, to continue her education, Milos sent Mileva to attend the Serbian School for Higher Learning in Novi Sad. There she earned the nickname the Holy One, because she was consistently at the head of the class. She would later learn that Albert Aјnštaјn had the same nickname in school. Mileva rejoined her family when her father was transferred to Zagreb, Croatia. As there were no secondary schools for girls, Milos petitioned for Mileva to attend the all-boy Royal Classical High School. She received the highest marks in math and physics for the 2 years that she attended. In 1895, Milos inherited a sizable farm in Kach, Vojvodina. He retired from civil service and built a large farmhouse. Mileva was sent to finish high school at a women's preparatory school in Zurich, Switzerland. Milos wanted his daughter to become one of the first female doctors. And in 1896, she entered the University of Zurich, which was the first university in Europe to allow women to study medicine. Mileva preferred to study physics and mathematics and convinced her father that she should transfer to Zurich Polytechnicum, Swiss Poly.
Mileva had a diploma of the Höhere Töchterschule, that was a school for women here in Zurich. But she had to pass an examination too, because that diploma was not enough. It was not a gymnasium. We are now in the room where the results of these examinations were presented to the students. So we know that in 1896, Mileva stood in October in this room and heard that she passed examination.
At Swiss Poly, she joined the section of boys which included Albert Aјnštaјn and Marcel Grossman. 17-year-old Albert was immediately taken with Mileva, who was 21. He was not only impressed with her scientific mind, but also her musical ability and disciplined determination. In many ways, Albert and Mileva were alike. They both had experienced ethnic prejudice and the upheaval of changing homes and living far away from family for the purpose of education. They each had earned nicknames because of their superior intellect, and now they were seeking the same degree. At the end of her first semester at Swiss Poly, Mileva left for the University of Heidelberg to audit the lectures of Philipp Lenard, a famous professor of theoretical physics.
Philipp Lenard is the co-author of the Lenard-Vickert equation, which describes how a charge affects another charge when they are separated by distance and time. It is a manifestly relativistic equation, and it was the symmetries of that equation and equations like that that led to special relativity.
In its 500-year history, the University of Heidelberg had allowed only 2 women to graduate. That was just the year before Mileva arrived. The Hotel Ritter, where she lived, was a student gathering center, and Mileva found herself caught up in social activity. Although Albert wrote calling her his little runaway, she didn't reply immediately. When she finally did respond, it was to tell him that the fog put her in a dreamy mood and to describe Leonard's lecture on the kinetic theory of gases. She also wrote,
Der Mensch wäre fähig, Unendlichkeit zu erfassen, wäre sein Denken nicht auf den menschlichen Schädel beschränkt. Dann wäre er frei, in das All vorzudrängen, ohne an unseren Erdball gebunden zu sein.
Mileva returned to Swiss Poly after one semester at the University of Heidelberg.
Zurich was the first university in Europe who accepted women as students. It was in the 1860s, and the first woman at the ETH was started studying in 1872. So that was for Europe already a big thing.
Albert became a daily fixture in her room on the top floor of the Engelbrecht boarding house. And as Mileva fell in love with him, her focus began to shift.
She arrived in Zurich as one of the first women to make their studies in mathematics. And she was a brilliant student. And then she met Albert, and in the beginning they shared the work, they shared the studies. And just after she came back from Heidelberg, she came back to Zurich again, and she realized that she was in love with this student, with Albert. And then she began to go behind him. She began to aim for his work and not anymore for her personal work.
When she learned of Albert's feelings for Mileva, his mother thought it was a schoolboy crush, and she teased him about it. Mileva's parents were happy to think that she had her first boyfriend and sent gifts for Albert. That semester, they attended the lectures of Professor Hermann Minkowski on his development of four-dimensional space-time geometry. And from this, they began to formulate the basis of the special theory of relativity.
Minkowski is considered by some to be the father of four-dimensional space-time. Before Minkowski and Aјnštaјn and this whole relativity, people considered space to be a flat thing, much like when you imagine a flat table, that's a two-dimensional flat space. Well, Minkowski gave us the mathematics to geometrically represent a unification of time and space.
Mileva attended the 37 hours of lectures that were required Monday through Saturday at Swiss Poly, including those of Professor Wilhelm Fiedler, who intimidated her and gave her a less than satisfactory grade in his class on projective geometry.
Professor Fiedler was already an elder professor when Mileva came to ETH, and I can imagine that he was a little bit conservative and that he had some problems with women as students.
Albert preferred to skip class often and work in the laboratory where Mileva would join him to work on their own experiments.
Mileva and Albert Aјnštaјn spent most of their students' time in the Institute of Physics. It was a new building up the hill here with one of the best academic laboratories of that time. But they were not very, they didn't agree with the professors there. Albert Aјnštaјn especially didn't like his lessons, and they searched for on their own and spent a lot of free time also in the laboratories.
And they spent many evenings at the cafe across the street from Albert's boarding house with other students, including Marcel Grossman, Friedrich Adler, and Michel Besso, who would all remain lifelong friends. Eventually, Mileva and Albert became lovers. Her landlady, Mrs. Engelbrecht, didn't suspect that this extremely serious, quiet young woman could romantically attract a young man as charming and gregarious as Albert was. Albert was Mileva's first and only love. Marcel Grossman suspected a deepening relationship, and with regard to Mileva's disability, he said, "I would never have the courage to marry a woman unless she were absolutely sound." When Albert's mother realized the relationship had become serious, she became hysterical in her denouncement of Mileva and wrote letters filled with scathing criticism, stating that no decent family would have her. Albert passed these letters along to Mileva, who tried to think of ways to win over Albert's mother. In the midst of this emotional confusion, Mileva took her final exams at Swiss Poly. Although her grade point average was passing, inexplicably, Mileva was denied a diploma by the Board of Examiners. Mileva had missed 2 semesters of work at Swiss Poly because of attending the University of Zurich and the University of Heidelberg, and this may have influenced the decision about her diploma. It is likely that she experienced the bias of professors who did not see a future for a woman in the sciences.
Quite difficult for women, especially at ETH, where technical sciences were taught. People thought that was nothing for women, and so they had to fight.
And women were graded with a different standard and attitude.
I know an anecdote of a famous professor who, still in the 1960s, very harshly criticized an assistant who wanted to give the highest grade to a woman. And he said he would never give the highest mark to a woman, even if she earned it. So that was in the 1960s, and we can think that earlier it was not better.
Mileva withdrew from Swiss Poly and went to her parents' new house in Novi Sad, Vojvodina. She applied for a teaching job in Zagreb. When Albert heard about this, he wrote that she could never be as important to the people of the Balkans as she was to him. Whether it was because of Albert's appeal or her father's insistence, Mileva returned to Zurich to prepare to retake her exams at the end of the following school year. She also began writing her doctoral thesis under the direction of Professor Weber, who was head of the physics department. During a break in the spring semester, Mileva traveled to Italy to meet Albert and returned to Zurich pregnant with his child.
In 1901, Mилева Мариќ once again tried to pass the examination, but she was already pregnant in the 6 months, and you can imagine that the pressure was quite high at that time.
She withdrew from Swiss Poly permanently and traveled to Novi Sad to face her parents with the scandal of her pregnancy. A year after graduation, Albert had not obtained a permanent job. Because of his poor grades and bad study habits, he could not get a recommendation from any of his professors. Pauline Aјnštaјn, adamantly against having Mileva as a daughter-in-law, sent a nasty letter to the Maриć home. Her father was furious and wanted Mileva to sever all ties with Albert. Desperately defending her lover, Mileva convinced her parents to pay for her visit to Switzerland, where Albert had a temporary job teaching school. Mileva returned home without a promise of marriage. Her mother said Albert ought to be thrashed. Albert continued to write, asking about the health of the unborn baby and making references to the theories that he and Mileva were developing.
I will be so happy when we are together again and can bring our work on relative motion to a successful conclusion.
In February 1902, Milos informed Albert that he had a baby daughter and that Mileva had almost died giving birth. Albert did not visit. He would never see his daughter. With the help of his school friend, Marcel Grossman, Albert finally secured a permanent job at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern in June 1902. He moved into a boarding house around the corner from the Patent Office, and with 2 new acquaintances formed the Olympia Academy to study philosophy and science. He also helped his old school friend, Michel Besso, acquire a job at the Patent Office. Still, he did not marry Mileva, claiming that he did not have his parents' permission. He was 23, legally of age to marry without consent. It was only after the unexpected death of his father in the fall, Albert proposed to Mileva. Leaving her 11-month-old daughter with her family in Novi Sad, Mileva became Mrs. Albert Aјnštaјn on January 3, 1903. The only guests at the wedding were his new friends, Maurice Solovay and Konrad Habig. Albert's mother never accepted the marriage, or Mileva as her daughter-in-law. Mileva was unhappy in the boarding house. She wanted a home of her own where she could bring her daughter. She wrote to a friend in Belgrade, seeking teaching jobs for her and Albert, hoping to be able to have their daughter with them without scandal. Working in Belgrade did not materialize, and believing an illegitimate daughter would affect his position at the patent office, Albert convinced Mileva to return to Novi Sad in September 1903 and arranged to relinquish her 17-month-old daughter to adoption. With inconsolable grief that would never leave her, she returned to Bern. Mileva was pregnant again when she and Albert moved to an apartment on Kamgrasa Street. She had her own home, but she would never have her daughter in it. While Albert was at his desk at the patent office, Mileva submerged herself in reading scientific journals and conducting research. When Albert returned home, they worked together until well after midnight. Shortly after the birth of Hans Albert in May 1904, the couple completed 3 papers on Brownian motion, the photoelectric effect, and special relativity.
The paper on Brownian motion discusses the work of Brown of nearly a century earlier, where he noticed that dust particles, when observed under a microscope, seemed to jerk around, dance around, and he postulated this is because they were being bombarded by atoms and molecules. Einstein found a way to do a numerical calculation and predict, based on this phenomena, how fast, say, a drop of ink in water would diffuse to fill up the whole glass. The photoelectric effect is this. When you shine light on a particular metal, electrons can be ejected. Now, the certain way in which this manifests itself was completely unexplained. No theory could explain it. What Einstein did was he took an idea of Planck, that energy comes in discrete units, that energy is quantized, and by applying this hypothesis to the experimental data, was able to explain it in a way that no one had ever done before. Relativity tells us that time and space are not absolutes, that they depend on the relative motion between the measurer and the thing that the measurer is observing, and that there is no absolute frame of the universe, some absolute stage upon which all the players play, and there is no universal clock that keeps the beat for everyone.
In Vojvodina, they finished a 4th paper, the one containing the famous equation, E equals mc squared.
The mathematics of special relativity are very easy. It's basically algebra. Some of the relationships that are used were created by Lorentz already 10 years before, and the manipulation of the equations is very simple. It's the interpretation that is the difficult part.
All 4 papers were published in 1905. One of the assistant editors at Annalen Physik recalls seeing Mileva's name as author on the original documents. Why she was not co-author upon publication is not explained.
If you look in the past, it's a sort of standard situation that there is a brilliant man and a brilliant woman, and the brilliant woman normally stays behind the man. It was absolutely normal in this time, and all other things would be not normal in this time. And so it is, for me, it is quite clear that it was this normal situation, and Mileva was in a rule to work for his husband, and she was also by character, I think, more into verse and more quiet, and so there was a sort of mechanism that he took the work, the ideas, and go outside with this.
Neither Mileva nor Albert expected the enormous fame that those papers would produce. In 1908, Albert received an honorary doctorate from the University of Geneva and a lecturing position at the University of Bern. In 1909, their school friend, Friedrich Adler, assisted Albert in getting hired as associate professor of theoretical science at the University of Zurich. The Einsteins moved into the same apartment building as the Adlers and took in a lodger to defray expenses. In Zurich, Mileva gave birth to a second son, Eduard, in 1910. With 2 children, a husband, and a lodger to contend with, Mileva had no time to attend Albert's lectures. Albert began to spend his time with students and other professors. The Aјnštaјns began to quarrel, and the Adlers believed that Albert was violent with Mileva.
It may have been to distract himself from marital problems that Albert entertained a proposal from the German University in Prague. Mileva adamantly resisted the move. The Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled Prague, and there was open bigotry against the Slavic people, more so than in Vojvodina. Albert would not receive a raise, and the physics department was not exceptional. Yet over Mileva's objections, Albert accepted the job. In Prague, the baby Eduard was sick much of the time, keeping Mileva restricted to the apartment, which was dirty and insect-infested. Albert socialized with a group of German-speaking Jewish intellectuals that included Franz Kafka and Max Brod. Mileva often remained home with the children while he attended soirees at the home of Berta Fanta. During his year in Prague, while visiting his mother in Berlin, Albert began an affair with his cousin Ilsa and continued to write to her from his office in Prague. At the end of the school year, Albert accepted a full professorship at Swiss Poly. Before returning to Zurich, Mileva took her sons to Novi Sad. In an attempt to assert her identity, she had her sons baptized into the Eastern Orthodox Church. She listed Albert's religion as Roman Catholic. Back in Zurich, the family moved into a large apartment. They had enough money to hire a maid, but the marriage was in trouble. Albert was teaching at the school where formerly he could not even get a job as an assistant to a professor, and in the same classroom where he had engaged Mileva to work with him. Now he was turning to Marcel Grossman for help on the mathematics for the general theory of relativity. Mileva was jealous and angry. As an Aјnštaјn biographer wrote, Mileva was as good at math as Grossman.
The mathematics of general relativity was created by people like Gauss and Riemann, who were interested in the mathematics of curved objects, curved space specifically. For example, you can curve a plane to make a ball, but they were interested in how you curve space to make a 4-dimensional ball, for example. And such mathematics was necessary to describe the curved space-time, the curvature of space that gravity causes.
Shortly after accepting the job in Zurich in 1912, Albert traveled to Berlin to visit his mother, his lover, and to speak to the members of the Royal Prussian Academy who had offered him a job there. The Aјnštaјns fought over the move to Berlin, which came in the middle of the school year and would uproot the children. Albert no longer cared what his family might want or need. He accepted the job and left for Berlin ahead of them. When Mileva arrived, he presented her a written memo stating to her that she would no longer have any conjugal relations with him, or sit with him at home, go out with him, or visit his office. She was to be his domestic servant, and nothing more.
His interest was changed. His work was changed. He did not anymore need her. He did not anymore want to discuss his work with her, and I think it was really, really hard for her.
Desperately unhappy, Mileva returned to Zurich with her 2 children at the end of the school term. World War I became an excuse for Albert not to visit or send money. But in 1916, when Albert wrote to ask for a divorce, he was already living with his mistress. Mileva was still in love with her husband and had lived with the hope that he would return to the family in Zurich. Now that she had lost him, she had to reflect on all that she had contributed to his life and all that she had surrendered to keep him, including the daughter that she loved.
She had this idea that they were a couple, they were a unity. And that's what then the tragic element in the rest of her life when he left her.
Completely defeated, she collapsed physically and emotionally and was in and out of hospital for a year. Michel Beso wrote to Albert about Mileva's serious condition. Albert replied that Mileva would do anything to hold on to him. As Mileva slowly recovered, the family lived in a small apartment near Swiss Poly. She supported herself and her children by tutoring in mathematics. Her famous husband was nominated for the Nobel Prize several times for the theory of relativity. And as they negotiated a divorce, they agreed that should he receive it, the money would go to Mileva. When Albert won the Nobel Prize, Mileva used her money to buy 2 rental properties and a large house for herself and her children. For 10 years, Mileva's life was comfortable financially. When he entered college, Edouard began having schizophrenic episodes and was institutionalized at Berhotzi Psychiatric Clinic. He received insulin shock therapy and electroshock treatment. His mind was ruined permanently. Edouard spent his life in and out of Berhotzi, and to cover his medical expenses, Mileva sold her rental properties. Hans Albert grew up to become a successful engineer. He designed a bridge that spans the Danube River in Novi Sad and taught at the University of California at Berkeley. When Hitler rose to power, there were threats against Albert's life, and he prepared to leave Europe with his second wife, Elsa. He visited Zurich to say goodbye to the family. He would never see Edouard or Mileva again. Mileva spent the remainder of her life taking care of Edouard and herself by tutoring in mathematics. She never clamored for the fame that was bestowed on her ex-husband. Given Mileva's natural shyness and her need to hide her first pregnancy, it is understandable that she never asserted her co-authorship with her husband. After the divorce, who would have believed her? At that time, women were not allowed to vote and barely allowed to be educated. What she did say quietly to her students was,
Ich habe immer zusammen mit meinem Mann gearbeitet.
I always worked with my husband.
I always worked with my husband.
I always worked with my husband.
Some light about this aspect of Albert Einstein's life, it was a question of justice, I think.